Okay, we are at 1 minute past the hour, so I think it is time to start this webinar. Thank you for joining, everyone, and welcome to this second, webinar on offshore renewable energy, hosted by us, Coalition Baltic, and WWF Baltic Eco-Region Program. My name is Niels, and I have the pleasure to, like I said, welcome you here, but also to sort of frame this conversation we're going to have today a little bit regarding the point you see on the screen, really the issue or the questions, if offshore wind can go hand in hand with marine protection and restoration of the Baltic Sea. Now, where are we when it comes to the Baltic situation? Well, the framing obviously is known to most of us now, that we're moving very fast. We have a lot of wishes and statements out there in relation to offshore wind. Not least regarding moving fast this year, both the status and the health of our marine environment and our marine life, and the potential of offshore wind to produce renewable electricity and deliver, well, energy security basically has been brought into sharp focus. The marine environment on one side and the push for delivering ambitions of offshore renewables is indeed on the agenda, or high up on the agenda. And considering the speed of development of offshore wind, the Baltic is worrying that there are no clear, for example, integrated maps of the planned developments, even the ones that are sort of known and planned of offshore renewables, and even less so, the future plans. We still need a lot better understanding of the development in relation to possibilities, but also the risks. We need to know and understand and talk about the gaps. And obviously, we need to understand the political frameworks that surrounds all this. So in a way, to answer the question that's on the slide, where are we now in the Baltic? Well, I think the answer is sort of, it seems we are not quite sure where we are in the Baltic, actually. So the frame for today, the double crisis, basically. We know we have a biodiversity and climate crisis acting in duality with each other or in related to each other. They're obviously linked. We know that. We cannot aim to solve one while missing sort of the target or missing to address the others, and vice versa, since we also know that climate is a very real crisis that we have to resolve with also more renewables, but without sacrificing biodiversity, etc. We basically need offshore wind, but we need it with nature in mind. This is what we know. So how do statements made, for example, this idea of nature positive, hold up? And in the case of nature positive, what does that actually look like? There seems to be clear knowledge gaps about cumulative impacts on biodiversity, marine life, bird life, and there seems to be a little bit of a void when it comes to understanding the risks of reaching certain tipping points, which might drastically change the marine environment. So that's a bit of the framing of the conversation today. And to lead us through this conversation about these issues with our guests, I would like to introduce to you Vanessa Ryan. She works for WWF and she is the Marine Conservation Officer at WWF Baltic Eco-Region Program. So Vanessa, please take over and let's lead our way into the conversation with our guests.
Thank you very much, Niels, and a very warm welcome to you all and a good afternoon from my side as well. Like as Niels said, I'm Vanessa Ryan, Marine Conservation Officer for WWF Finland, and I'm here today to guide our panelists through the very intriguing and important topic of combining offshore renewable energy with marine restoration and conservation. And I'm very proud to introduce our wonderful panel to you today. Let's start off with the introductions. First of all, we have Liga Rosentale. I hope that I don't butcher your name too badly, who is the Deputy State Secretary for the Ministry of Climate and Energy in Latvia and has been so since February 2023. And before joining the Ministry of Climate and Energy, Liga worked for the Latvian Ministry of Economics for more than 8 years in the Energy Market and Infrastructure Department. And Liga also has a PhD in environmental engineering from the Riga Technical University. So welcome very much to Liga. Secondly, we have Tina Tam Bendiksen, who works at Ørsted in Denmark as lead environment specialist and has been working with offshore wind for the last 13 years, so has a long career in the area. She's worked with environmental topics in all phases of wind farm projects, including the very early phases where the assessments or the assessments for the constraints for potential sites are done. Currently, she's involved in work related to the Ørsted biodiversity ambition and has a focus on nature-related initiatives in the Baltic Sea. Welcome very much to Tina. Thirdly, we have Dominic Auch, who has a background in geography and marine ecology. He completed his master's degree with a thesis on zooplankton in offshore wind farms, not something you hear about too often. Since October 22, he has been working at the Nature and Biodiversity Conservation Union, or NABU, as an officer for marine spatial planning and offshore wind. In international and national forums, he aims to improve the implementation of an effective ecosystem-based approach. And in addition, his work focuses on strategies to reduce anthropogenic pressure on the ecosystem in relation to offshore wind energy development. Welcome very much to Dominic. And last, but definitely not least, we have Andrew Lipsky with over 25 years of fisheries experience. He has worked at the NGO, private, industry, state, tribal, and federal levels. And he joined the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, and the Northeast Fisheries Science Center in 2016, and now serves as the center's offshore wind team lead. He currently co-chairs the International Council on the Exploration of the Seas Fisheries and Offshore Wind Working Group. He's a graduate of the USDA Graduate School Leadership Development Program. He holds an MS in Natural Resources Sciences from the University of Rhode Island and a BA from the University of Vermont. And he has also served as a visiting researcher at Brown University. So that was a brief round of introduction for our panel. Welcome to Andrew as well, and so glad that you could join us today. And as mentioned before, this is a very interesting and very complex topic as well. So let's kick off the conversation, and I will aim my first question at Liga. So the Baltic Sea EU countries have initially agreed to increase offshore wind production quite a bit to 19.6 gigawatts by 2030, and that target has since even been updated to 22.5 gigawatts by 2030, and that update was made this year. And actually a potential of up to 93 gigawatt by 2040. So where are we at currently in the Baltic region? And are there any obstacles that you see nationally or regionally for reaching these ambitious targets?
Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, thank you for inviting and for this interesting topic to discuss. To answer your question, well, I would say that if we look from Latvian perspective, we don't have any offshore wind parks currently. Well, of course, there are more advanced countries, but basically, if we speak about the Baltic countries, so Latvia and Estonia and Lithuania as well, then we don't have any offshore wind parks currently. And though, for example, for Latvia, the potential for the offshore wind parks is about 15 gigawatts in total. But our ambition for 2030 so far has been around 800 megawatts. So like 1/20 of all of the big 20 gigawatt target. What are the main issues currently is, at least for Latvia, it is the fact that we, first of all, want to have the auctioning procedure. We don't have that because historically, the only thing that we were going to do in the sea was research for oil. And so historically we had some rules regarding licensing areas for researching and extracting oil. That hasn't gone very far, though we gave out some permits, nothing happened there. So that's about it regarding energy, extracting energy from the sea, from our territorial sea. So we are currently working on the auctioning procedure, and the one project that is kind of more further than any other of the projects in Latvia is the Elwind project that we are creating together with Estonia. So that's an offshore wind park that we want to do commonly with Estonia. And for that, the project developers have finally signed an agreement with the European Commission for financing regarding the environmental impact assessment. So they are now at the step to begin environmental impact assessment, hopefully this year. And yeah, but so it's a lengthy procedure after that to do the environmental impact assessment, and we need to have so for the Elwind project, it's somehow going forward because it's a state project, but for other private projects, it's a bit more difficult. So we have to have the licensing procedure, the auctioning procedure, and eventually there was some interest at the beginning for the offshore wind parks, and currently we see that some of the project developers couldn't wait for us to move forward with the necessary regulation and legislation, and it seems that perhaps the investors have taken their investments somewhere else. So yeah, currently there is less interest, but of course there is. We still need to finalize the regulation, so it comes hand in hand. And why we haven't finalized also the regulation is the fact regarding the capacities, the grid capacities, and it's all linked together with the capacities that we have onshore, and they are fully booked. And for offshore capacities, we are looking also for interconnections with Germany and with Sweden, and it's somehow not moving forward as fast as we would hope.
Thank you very much, Liga. So noticing some difficulties there with licensing procedures and legislation and grid capacities and interconnections and others. And you mentioned the environmental impact assessment procedure. And here I'd like to turn my eyes to Dominic. Obviously, offshore wind projects do have some sort of an impact on marine biodiversity as well. So what do we know about the impacts at the moment on, for example, bird migrations or bird populations, harbor porpoise, other marine mammals? Dominic, would you give us an overview?
Yeah, I mean, giving really an overview over the whole set of effects might be well too large for this webinar. So let me just say a few words. So, I mean, in general, effects can be distinguished as related to the construction or the decommission or the operational phase. So the effects can either work quite directly or also in some instances very indirectly through cascading effects. For example, when the hydrography is affected, then this might have an effect on the entire food web. And these kinds of effects are hardly investigated and understood yet. What we can much more, what we know much more about are the direct effects. So, for instance, on seabirds, when we have collision risks increased or habitat losses, especially for some seabird species, they have really huge avoidance distances. For example, common guillemots or also sea divers, loon species, they have avoidance rate or avoidance distances of more than 10 kilometers. So they avoid the radius around these offshore wind farms. So there is a lot of habitat loss which has to be taken into consideration. And for marine mammals, of course, we have the noise emissions, which is quite a problem, especially since the turbines are getting bigger and bigger. So in Germany, there is a noise reduction or limitation concept where it's said that noise should be limited to, so the pile driving noise should be limited to 160 decibels. As it's known that there are direct organ damage to harbor porpoises at a noise level of 164 decibels. So it's tried to keep the noise emissions below that level. Nonetheless, we also have to face the fact that also, for example, the feeding is reduced when you have this regular noise emissions. Then the feeding of the harbor porpoise is stopped, which might have in the long term then quite devastating effects, as they have to feed continuously to gain large fat storage so that they can survive also the colder period, which might be more complicated when you have this all these different construction sites, which are actually not the only noise source, but adding up to the noise that we already have related to shipping and other anthropogenic uses.
Thank you very much, Dominic. That was a good attempt at trying to describe the effects that offshore wind can have on and has on biodiversity, both in the building and decommissioning and operational phases. Now I'm turning my eyes to Tina. As an industry actor, how can you, when thinking about the effects that Dominic was describing there, how can you contribute as an industry to protecting and restoring nature and minimizing the impacts that you have? And how do you measure that success or failure, or how do you measure it?
I mean, we have several opportunities to do something about at these things when we plan the projects. I mean, we can go via the mitigation hierarchy, where we try to avoid and we try to minimize. And if we can't do that, we can restore and we can mitigate. So it depends, and we can also even do offsetting if none of the others are successful. But I think there are different things you can do in the planning and in the layout and in which technical solutions you choose. But that's again, it's also a huge area and depends on where you are and what the limitations for our projects are. But what we are doing at Ørsted at the moment, which I find really important to mention here, what we can do for that, for nature, is that we have developed our own biodiversity strategy. We have set an ambition that we want to be net positive by 2030, or for the projects commissioned by 2030. And in order to get there, I mean, we have worked on that for 2 years now. We have set a team of specialists dealing with this. So we have a whole team global-wise dealing with biodiversity topics, trying to identify different projects we can learn from. So in the period towards 2030, we have started different pilot projects to learn what can actually be done. And we do that in the different regions we are in. We have also worked together with a company to try to set up a measurement framework for that, using science-based targets, as we know, but applying them for actually offshore wind, which has not been done before. So we work. We don't have all the answers and the final calculation yet, but we're working on that, and we have. Right now, we are testing a tool on 5 of our projects for that. So that is some of the things we do. When it comes to the Baltic Sea region, we have me and my colleagues from Denmark, Germany, Poland, Sweden. We have set up a strategy where we want to set up some goals for that region. And some of our goals are, for example, to share the knowledge we have with different stakeholders in the region, and we want to support research in the region. That could be that we are sharing knowledge or data if we have data. We do not have so many data from that specific region, but and also just taking part in reference groups and giving inputs to different, for example, the Vinvolt reports, and trying really to share what we already know from the 30 years of experience we have from offshore wind. So, yeah.
Thank you, Tina. And before I hand over and ask Andrew a question, I will actually refer back to Dominic. Tina was talking, we were talking a little bit about the measures for protecting and restoring that the industry can have. And then I was wondering, Dominic, do you see any potential co-benefits between offshore renewable energy and wildlife or biodiversity protection? And what would those be? Do you have any examples to give us?
Well, I mean, for example, since fishing is, at least in most countries, it's forbidden within the vicinity of the offshore wind farms, we might have, in effect, that fish find good food resources within the offshore wind farms. But yeah, one always has to see if there are actually any spillover effects, if we can really gain any population effects, as yeah, if we just have an attraction effect and directly around the offshore wind farms there is a lot of fishing going on, then these effects might be actually, yeah, quite substantially reduced. Yeah, so for some species that can actually dwell on these hard substrates, of course, there are positive ecological effects, such as, for example, blue mussels and other sessile species. Yeah, so one always has to see if actually the substrate which is added to the natural habitat is somewhat which can provide a substrate which relates or is similar to the naturally occurring substrate, then there might be some additional substrate to dwell on. But on the other hand, if we put a lot of offshore wind in soft bottom habitats, then we might add, of course, for some species an additional habitat, but this would not actually be in the natural habitat. And if in the end these power plants are then decommissioned again, then yeah, the question still arises: what happens to these hard bottom substrates then?
Thank you, Dominic. Valid questions. Handing over to Andy now. Looking in maybe from the outside of the Baltic Sea region, do you have any comments or anything to add to what has been said thus far? And then I will ask you another question after that, so don't relax yet.
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
I lost connectivity during the first part of the session, so I'm going to shut my video off. You can see me. This is who I look like, so that way I don't lose you in the middle of a sentence.
Right.
Thank you for including me. It's morning here in New England, and yeah, just reflecting on this conversation, and I think this is a key question, because our countries and the globe are pursuing our decarbonization strategies to address our climate crisis. Offshore wind is a central pillar in those strategies in almost every continent that's pursuing the climate mitigation efforts. But we have to do this and achieve coexistence with existing uses and address our marine ecosystem conservation and protection objectives. And I think it's laudable. I think Tina mentioned the efforts that Ørsted is making to achieve what is being called sort of a net gain approaches. And I think that's critical. I think one of the things that myself and other researchers and scientists, both in the U.S. and in Europe, particularly in the work that we are doing through ICES, there's a number of offshore renewable and offshore wind science expert groups in ICES where we get to collaborate on on understanding the interactions with wind development in the marine ecosystem. I chair a fisheries working group, but one of the key problems that we see in achieving this coexistence is having effective and integrated scientific monitoring frameworks in place. There's a number of publications and evidence, starting with the 2019 oceanography series, that really shows that while we have decades of development of offshore wind energy in the North Sea, this is not a new use, but that new use is changing in pace, scale, and magnitude, and new technologies such as floating. We know very little about the interactions of wind development beyond the turbine level because of the lack of consistent, integrated, and robust monitoring systems. And this is a problem that I've discussed, with many of our stakeholders, including the offshore wind industry, is having standardized approaches to measuring these interactions across the various impact producing effects that Dominique had listed. Some of these are noise, electromagnetic fields, aggregation effects, benthic and pelagic habitat alteration through marine and atmospheric wind wake effects, invasive species, entanglement, displaced fishing effort, and contaminants. And like I said, this big challenge of understanding potential oceanographic wind wake effects. We can only address this uncertainty by ensuring that we have robust monitoring approaches in place. This is something that our collection of scientists through ICES across Europe and North America have identified as a sort of a premier challenge, in something that we need to work on. If we want to get to a net gain, you can't get to a net anything if we're not collecting data to determine what your baseline is. And if we're only measuring these effects at these and with 1 or 2 years of pre-construction and for data, if we're lucky, it's very difficult to measure any type of cause and effect relationship between a receptor, such as a marine mammal or a fish species or a habitat, and a stressor, such as an impact producing factor. So that's some initial reactions to what I just heard.
Thank you very much, Andy. You actually stole my second question because I was going to go into knowledge gaps, etc. But you did cover that quite well. But I'm not going to let you off the hook quite yet. You're talking a lot about things that need to be done. So standardized approach to data collection, etc. Do you think it is achievable to reach our to combine this rapid large-scale offshore energy infrastructure development with still reaching our goals for protecting the marine environment? Do you think it's possible?
That's a large question. I'm an optimist, and so I would say yes. But like any other type of natural resource extraction, or in our history of pursuing natural resources or new discoveries, when we go fast, large, and at a high magnitude, that pay scale, and we don't think through these interactions and ensure that we've done the best job to put science in place, we tend to stumble, and we end up paying the cost for those mismatches. So this is totally achievable. I don't see us planning offshore wind energy at least from my vantage point. We need to have these goals of addressing climate change, addressing this new development in tandem with conservation and protection of marine ecosystem functions and services. So doing that together is a challenge for our planning. What I do see is us trying to figure out where can we put these structures and minimize or avoid these negative consequences. And some of these interactions with the marine ecosystem can be positive. I'm not saying they're all negative at all. But if we aren't measuring the interactions, there's no way to say whether it's a positive or a negative or neutral. And when we move fast and we haven't employed what we understand, from our history of offshore energy or land-based energy sources, then we could create some challenges for us to achieve that coexistence paradigm, which I know we're all interested in achieving, but we do need to think through how do we do that and design. For instance, we're not designing offshore wind energy areas. We're not citing them in areas to promote marine biodiversity. It may be an enhancement if there is increased number of species using a site. But if we're displacing fishing effort and that fishing effort goes somewhere else, then we may not see those types of positive benefits because we have existing uses there. And we may not also be citing wind development where we need, in terms of creating extra structure to meet a life stage of a wildlife or fish species that's limiting. So those types of dual goals or objectives can be quite challenging. Marine spatial planning and ecosystem-based management approaches do exist, and we could be using them to optimize those objectives, those dual objectives of decarbonization, offshore wind development, conservation of marine biodiversity. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Well, it does partly, but it's a big question, so I didn't expect to get a holy grail answer. Thank you, Andy. Moving back to Liga now, we were talking about tools that are at our disposal. What kind of tools do you as a national authority have to guide the placement of offshore wind? Marine spatial planning was mentioned as one, and to minimize the conflicts with biodiversity protection targets. Do you have enough tools? Are they adequate? And do you have any tools in the toolbox that are missing?
Mm-hmm. I would say that maritime spatial plan is the biggest one. I mean, at least for I know that all three Baltic states have very specific areas that can be meant for wind parks. In Latvia, we have 5 areas that are drawn into the maritime spatial plan, and there are very specific restrictions what cannot be in these areas, like, I don't know, Natura 2000 or other restricted areas is a no-go for wind parks. At the same time, Ministry of Environment is, so that's additional ministry, that one is working on ongoing biodiversity researches in the Baltic Sea, and sometimes they can also spread into the areas that are currently meant for the wind parks, and that may also narrow down the wind park area. And from that perspective, actually, for the ministry that is responsible for energy sector, that is worrisome, considering that we don't have any offshore wind parks currently. So we have certain areas where they could be, but they might also narrow down the areas, and then now we still don't have any wind parks, so we don't know what where the wind parks will eventually be. And of course, it all comes down to environmental impact assessment, where even if a specific area from the spatial maritime spatial plan is chosen for the wind park, it's still covered fully by environmental impact assessment, and either there are mitigation measures or there are suggestions to move away to certain part of, as the wind park areas are very large, and there might be parts or corners that are not welcomed for wind parks anyway. And so I think that tools there are rather many to save the biodiversity or to compensate any risks that might arise, but yeah, we just, as the previous panelists also said, we have to balance the needs for biodiversity and for the wind parks.
Yeah, thank you, Liga. And I would actually have a follow-up as well. Recently, there was a report published by the EU Court of Auditors on offshore renewable energy in the EU. And interestingly, they picked up a fact that very few states that share waters plan common offshore renewable energy projects. And how can we increase that cooperation between different states in the Baltic, and how do we deal with cross-border impacts as well, because we have a lot of projects popping up in different countries. on each side of the borders. So how do we do that? And you were talking about that Elwin project as well that you have jointly with Estonia. So how can we make these projects more collaborative?
Well, I guess it depends on the relationships between countries. Historically, the Baltic states have been very close. We have been called brothers and etc. So, I mean, we have very different cooperation formats, and our state secretaries are on informally in a WhatsApp group. So it's a different situation. They are communicating all the time, and so it's much more easier to decide on common projects if you are on this friendly basis with the neighboring country, where you just write in a WhatsApp chat, hey, what about a common wind park? But of course that's a joke. But I mean, it's much easier for historically friendly countries to do that, and we have discussed also with Lithuanians whether there could be a common wind park, and we are also discussing common infrastructure interconnection project with Germany that would serve for all 3 Baltic states. So I think it also, of course, depends on the formal formats that we have. We have, for example, the Baltic Council of Ministers, the BEMIP group, which is Baltic Energy Market Interconnection Plan. We have, of course, also unrelated formats such as, I don't know, Regional Gas Market Coordination Group, etc. And this is all only for these 3 Baltic states and in an energy sector. So we are closely linked. As regards the what if we know what the other country is doing, I think that is covered with the environmental impact assessment that has to be coordinated between the countries. I mean, we very often receive notices of environmental impact assessment in the neighboring countries, including Sweden, Denmark, etc. And we are allowed to join them. We are actually, it's kind of a task that we see that it can impact our country. We should join it and say our opinion. So I don't think that there is an option that a wind park might be built without us knowing it. In the Baltic Sea, all the member countries can and will see what is built there, and it will all be coordinated.
Thank you, Liga. And now I'm turning my eyes towards Tina again, talking about cooperation. How much do you cooperate and coordinate with other members of the offshore industry? And do you have any joint collection and data collection and monitoring processes ongoing? How can you plan, for example, for infrastructure that could serve multiple projects at the same time and thus minimize the environmental impacts?
I think we do have some good cooperation in different industry groups in the countries we are present in. We have examples of us joining and adding all our data to scientific reports. For example, for underwater noise in Germany, we have made that together with the other industry partners. So we do that. We also have an example from Germany where we had actually surveys monitoring done together with other developers. We had a huge monitoring program for mammals and birds. I was actually project manager for that one, and it included 16 different projects in different stages, from early planning to operating wind farms. So I think when we do that, we also get a very good data set that can be used, and I agree it can be really good to have looked at these standards for how you measure and do it more in a broader scale and than just look at one single project. But again, we are in a fierce competition sometimes, and that can make it very difficult to work together. I mean, if we have a set permit system where we already have our permits, it's much easier for us to do something. But if we are all competing kind of for the same area, if we have these greenfield areas where we start developing and others develop as well, it can be very difficult to work together on anything because then the data are very sensitive. But I think we try to share where it's possible, and we also communicate a lot with each other. And we also have Wind Europe where we are in a working group together with others. And the part about it's difficult maybe to share anything that we construct. That could be a substation maybe that you can share for different offshore wind farm projects. It could also be something about putting the cables maybe in the same channels, but it can be a difficult one, I think. That would rather be maybe the onshore part where you have something also about the grid connection for that one.
Thank you, Tina. And just to maybe ask the same question as I asked Liga about the regional cooperation. Do you think there is enough steering from a regional point of view as well with the placement of offshore wind parks? Do you think that there would be a need for more cooperation
I
there?
think, yeah, I definitely think there will be a need for more cooperation between the countries, especially when you see the Baltic Sea area. I think that could be really good to have that. And I mean, it's very different how it's done with if you have an auction or you don't have an auction, or if you have appointed sites or not. And there can be pros and cons for us as developer, especially because we have experience. But I think for new developers, it can be quite difficult if you only have these greenfield areas you have to compete for. So yeah, it's I think we definitely need more cooperation and maybe also kind of data sharing and more in a standardized way and a system for doing that, and also taking into account that some data will be sensitive. There must be kind of a system for that as well. But I think that is a need if you want to develop all these wind farms going forward.
Thank you, Tina. Dominic, if you could be decision maker for a day, what recommendations would you have for ensuring that the expansion of offshore renewable energy is sustainable and environmentally responsible? That was also a very tough and very broad question, but there you go. You can decide now for the day.
Yeah, so certainly we must not make the failure to understand conservation just as one user within the marine spatial planning process, but understand the ecosystem as the baseline, which provides us with so many different services that we rely on. So therefore, we should also put the ecosystem at the base of planning, saying like implementing an ecosystem-based management, with which we can first see what kind of ecological values and demands are in the different regions, and then make the planning based on that. And making the planning does not mean to me that the ecosystem does not stop at national borders, but the ecosystem is really interconnected between the different regions. And therefore, I would say that we should certainly also base the planning of offshore wind based on ecological areas that we have, that we should I mean, right now we have really national goals that everyone's sticking to, but when really trying to put the ecosystem at the base of planning, then we should actually try to further improve the collaboration regarding offshore wind planning, because some countries, they really have huge exclusive economic zones with much more space, which might not be ecologically that relevant as in some other countries where we have a huge energy demand, but very limited space within the exclusive economic zone. And therefore, it would make much more sense to accept the fact that some countries might more be importing energy from areas abroad, rather than sticking really to these national goals that have to be somehow put in the very limited space of the exclusive economic zone.
Thank you very much, Dominic. Now I would like to open the floor. Is there anything that the panelists want to get off their chest, which they haven't had a chance to say, or maybe react to someone else's comments? I see a very quiet floor. So you can think about that for a while I was actually going to hand over to Andy, but go ahead, and then I will ask you a follow-up question if you don't cover that in your speaking turn. Go ahead, Andy.
Just a couple points. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Just a couple points, and I don't know how relevant this is to the Baltic. It's a sea basin I'm not very experienced in, but I mentioned it earlier, but floating offshore and wind technologies, whether it would be deployed in the Baltic or not, it depends on the depths being considered. But that's a fairly large unknown because we don't have any commercial scale floating offshore wind developments anywhere on Earth yet. But it's a massively new and likely deployable technology in the foreseeable future. I think our Department of Energy expects a 68-fold increase in floating wind. And so how floating interacts with the marine ecosystem is a fairly large unknown, because there might be some things that are very similar to what we know about fixed turbines, and also there's likely large unknowns. The second thing I wanted to get off my chest, something I didn't address, but in a recent paper from Stephanie Haas from the Tunen Institute, who's also a member of my working group, the interaction of offshore wind development on our scientific surveys and science advice has been an underappreciated impact, because we're adding structures to the marine ecosystem at a fairly large spatial scale in our long-term scientific surveys, which are our environmental intelligence, which tell us how the ecosystem is doing, so we can set stock advice through like ICES, or from the US through our fisheries management processes, depend on our ships and our observation systems collecting data in a consistent fashion using methods and platforms that we've developed really over decades. Offshore wind development will disrupt that survey enterprise. It may not be the sky is falling, but we need to design new survey methods in close coordination with this development, because we're going to have to, because our large ships are no longer going to have access to these areas once we put cables and turbines in. If we don't do that, the uncertainty in our advice will increase, which will have a detrimental effect even on how we plan offshore wind developments. So that's been a very underappreciated interaction between wind development and our objectives of sustainable use of wind development and marine ecosystem conservation.
Thank you, Andy. I think we actually have a couple of questions here in the Q&A and in the chat, and we can maybe quickly have a look at them. One question here is, bringing out huge amounts of hard substrate over the coming years is nothing short of an exercise in geoengineering. At least in the North Sea, we will basically create the world's largest artificial reef, with interesting implications for biological succession and diversity on site. I feel we are not acknowledging this properly, nor do we take the long-term perspective needed to address this. So how do we satisfy short-term conservation policies with these long-term implications? Is there anyone who would like to take this question? No one seems too keen on answering it at the moment, but I'm sure you can also type an answer in the Q&A window here if you feel like doing that. Another question is in the chat, where someone is curious how the panel sees improvements for comprehensive planning of offshore wind farms. In order to limit cumulative effects from multiple farms in the same area, or potential synergy by combining infrastructure. A limitation of EIA is that it usually addresses single developments. And I think we did touch a little bit upon the EIA and the fact that countries do get the chance to comment on other projects in other countries. But do you also see the limitation of the EIA, and is that sufficient? And maybe I can ask Liga this question, or Dominic also, I think, is raising his hand tentatively.
Yeah.
Let's go Liga first, Dominic second.
Yes, thank you. I would say it's rather impossible to have this comprehensive planning because it's all basically in the end based on the demand and supply. I mean, how the entrepreneurs see their wind parks developing, and we cannot really foresee what will be the total development. We of course, the state is the one who creates the auctions, but we don't know what will eventually come out from that, how large eventually will be the capacity, where will the connection in the end will be. It's hard to do that all in advance, and it will create the process much more longer and difficult for the one entrepreneur who is actually developing the plant at that time. When he needs the environmental impact assessment anyway. And then if we try to kind of add up everything that is on the table and that could also be in the same spatial area, then it would be overburden for the entrepreneur at that point. So I think it would be excellent if we could do that, but I don't see really in practice how to do that comprehensively.
Thank you, Liga. I'll give Dominic the floor quickly before I hand over to Niels to wrap up discussion.
Yeah, I certainly see a very valid point in that question. As actually, most of the environmental impact assessments really focus on one specific project, and in the end, there are so many indirect effects or effects that, for example, if we have very long-lived species, these effects might just occur. For example, a decade later, that we really have then a population effect that we have not anticipated before. So that's why we really always call for a really stepwise expansion of offshore wind farms, so that it's more easily more easy to really assess the effects that are emerging from this cumulative anthropogenic use. But in terms of these very giant expansion of offshore wind farms, it's getting quite complicated to get this comprehensive assessments in time before we have actually expanded the offshore wind development that far.
Thank you, Dominic.
Can I say
yes?
last remark? I was just now you talked about the Liga, you talked about the auctions that you are going to do. I think it could be a good idea if you, for future auctions, also put something with nature into the auctions, because we tend to compete on price all the time. I think that must be a future thing to do if we want to be the nature to play a bigger role in what we develop out there. It's just
thank you, Tina. Very good reminder that there are tools in the toolbox there as well. I would like to, from my perspective and point of view, thank all the panelists for a very interesting discussion. We could have gone on, but our time is limited, and I have given Niels now 5 minutes to wrap up, and finish.
Yeah, indeed, short and sweet, as this conversation has been as well. As a wrapper up person, I get to basically speak undisputed, which is great, of what I felt that you guys have been saying and what we feel about this process in general. As I said when I started, I said we know, all of us knows, including NGOs, regardless of what we sound like sometimes, and I think also scientists, etc. We all know that we need offshore wind to resolve the issues in the climate crisis we are facing. We know that, but we also know, and to use the phrase just so beautifully now used by Tina, we can't do it without nature, basically. We have to do it with nature in mind. And this is really what we're struggling to find ways forward. And we've heard a number of good things today. But one thing I also need to say as from us in the NGO perspective is that, and not just because I came from a long conference last week where we discussed marine protection and marine protected areas a lot, but partly that. We have fought sometimes for 15 years to establish marine protected area based on a massive amount of data and science to prove to everyone that this is really an important area, something that we feel sometimes should be reversed. That burden of proof should be reversed to the people that wants to fight for business as usual. But still, to go into those areas, hard fought. And I'm really thankful for Liga who said that, you know, these Natura 2000 areas, you know, obviously we're not going there, or we're not doing that, or restricted. To fight over these MPA's establishment and then only to allow windmills in there or wind farms in there, it's for us a simple no. It is just, I don't know, it's almost, I was going to say, well, I will say it, spit in the face in the people that have been working on it for a long time. But also, I feel, to fishermen that have been excluded or are excluded from these areas, that we're allowing other things to go there. And it's important for us to say that as NGOs. But let me go back to reflection over some of you guys' comments. First of all, I want to be part of that WhatsApp group, Liga, that these state secretaries have. That's very interesting. I think we could resolve a lot of things if we chat away like that. But it's very comforting in a way to hear a company like Ørsted say that, no, we have our own biodiversity plan. We have a strategy and ambition to really be that positive and to really take these considerations seriously. And now just lastly, asking for contractors or auctions to really put that as a requirement, knowing obviously, hopefully, I guess, because that you guys have a competitive edge there. But indeed, the words that you said, we'd love to share, we'd love to work together, but we're also competitors. That's not easy. So that's obviously food for thought, and everyone needs to understand that. But another thing that I was really happy to hear is that you feel, Liga, that impact assessments are really the key tool. That's what we're using to actually identify and decide, because we know that there are some pressure from some instances of sort of skipping that phase, which we, at least as NGOs, feel very strongly about. So thank you for that. Obviously, I hear what you're saying, Andrew. Going fast and large is problematic, and without measuring and monitoring, you know, we can't get net anything. That's basically what you said. And net positive, net this, net that. True. This is very true. And thanks for introducing those new elements of understanding that bigger farms or cumulative effects of farms can also disrupt very old sort of data sets, time series that we've been doing for a long time to understand what's going on in the environment. That's a really important point, I think. And that there are still a lot of unknowns. You point to that, Andrew, in a good way. I mean, we know a lot on the sort of farm level or the turbine level, but we don't know on the wider scale. And obviously, you know, Tina, you also admitted that we don't. You're aiming to get more answers on that, but we really don't. So there's still a lot of questions, a lot of issues, but at least there is I feel, somewhat collected view of nature has to be there. We use the tools we have and really look to the impact assessment to make sure we're avoiding the most stupidest things. But I want to end on the point Dominic made. It is crucial that we understand that the ecosystem is not a player or an actor or part in this. It is actually the ultimate limit of what we can do in this sort of coexistence world Andy was mentioning. And we just cannot look beyond that. And we have to stop looking beyond that, because ecosystem-based management at a heart is really focusing to these trade-offs. If we want this, we can't have that. And that's, I think, is the final note for me in closing this webinar. And thank you for everyone taking part, of course, listening, and you guys to speak to us about this. I cannot promise we will come back in this shape and format, but maybe we will to continue this conversation. In the meantime, obviously, both CCB and WWF have a lot of information and updating information on our website regarding this. Obviously, we also push for other events, seminars, etc. So we all need to continue this conversation to resolve some of these issues that we've talked about today, because it's clear that we're not home yet. But at least maybe things aren't moving as fast as some of us are afraid of. Liga said that we know stuff that goes on in other member states before they happen. So it feels like that chat group, again, we should be all in on that one. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Have a great last part of this day and a fantastic week.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.